The sun was setting over the quiet town of Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty road that cut through the heart of the community. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But that evening something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. At the edge of town, a group of bikers roared into the local diner, their engines growling, like wild beasts. They were loud, brash, and carried an air of menace that made the regulars shift uncomfortably in their seats. Among them was their leader, a man known only as Viper, whose cold eyes and sneering smile seemed to promise trouble. Inside the diner, sitting quietly in a corner booth, was a woman named Clara. She was a big woman, her presence as warm and comforting as the homemade pies she loved to bake. Clara was no stranger to judgment. She'd spent her life navigating a world that often dismissed her because of her size and the color of her skin. But she carried herself with a quiet dignity, her smile disarming even the harshest critics. Tonight, though, her usual calm was tinged with unease. She could feel the bikers' eyes on her, their whispers cutting through the hum of the diner. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the book in her hands, but the tension in the room was palpable. It started with a comment loud enough for everyone to hear, a crude joke about her weight, followed by laughter that felt like a slap. Clara's heart sank, but she kept her composure, refusing to give them the reaction they were clearly hoping for. But then it escalated. One of the bikers, a burly man, with a scar running down his cheek, sauntered over to her table. He leaned in, his breath reeking of beer, and said something so vile it made her blood run cold. Clara's hands trembled as she set her book down, her mind racing. She knew she was outnumbered, but she also knew she couldn't let this slide. "You need to leave me alone," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Biker laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the diner. "Or what?" he sneered, his friends egging him on from across the room. Clara's mind raced. She thought about her husband, Marcus, who was away on business. Marcus was her rock, her protector, the one person who always made her feel safe. But he wasn't here now, and she was on her own. Just as the biker reached out to grab her arm, the door of the diner slammed open, the sound like a gunshot in the tense silence. All eyes turned to the figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Marcus. But this wasn't the Marcus she knew. The man who walked into the diner that night was different. Harder, colder, his eyes blazing with a fury that made even the bikers take a step back. Clara had always known her husband was a Marine, but she'd never seen this side of him before. The side that made him the most feared man in his unit. The side that made him a legend. Marcus didn't say a word as he strode across the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone there. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering under his steely gaze. Viper, their leader, stood up, trying to regain control of the situation. "This doesn't concern you, buddy," he said, his voice dripping with false confidence. Marcus didn't even blink. "You mess with my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You mess with me." The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men faced off, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Clara watched, her heart pounding as her husband stood between her and the bikers, a shield of unwavering strength. But even as relief washed over her, a new fear took root, because she knew Marcus, and she knew that when he looked like this, things were about to get very, very bad. The bikers, unaware of the storm they'd just unleashed, were about to learn the hard way that you don't mess with a Marine's wife. But what happened next would change everything, for Clara, for Marcus, and for the town of Willow Creek. And as the first punch was thrown, the diner erupted into chaos, leaving everyone wondering, who would walk away from this fight, and at what cost? The sound of shattering glass echoed through the diner as Marcus's fist connected with Viper's jaw, sending the biker crashing into a table. The room erupted into chaos, chairs scraping against the floor, shouts filling the air, and the other bikers surging forward to defend their leader. Clara's heart raced as she watched her husband move with a precision and ferocity that left her in awe. Every punch, every block, every step was calculated, a testament to years of training and discipline. But even as Marcus held his own, Clara couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. This wasn't just a bar fight. This was something deeper, something darker, and she had no idea how it would end. As the bikers scrambled to regroup, Marcus grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Clara didn't argue. She followed him out into the cool night air, the sound of the bikers' angry shouts fading behind them. They ran to their truck, Marcus keeping a protective arm around her as he scanned their surroundings. Clara could feel the tension radiating off him, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. She wanted to ask him what was going on, why he was so on edge, but the look in his eyes told her now wasn't the time. They drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Clara stole glances at Marcus, trying to read his expression. He was always so calm, so steady, but tonight he looked different. There was a hardness in his eyes, a distance that made her heart ache. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, feeling the muscles tense beneath her touch. "Marcus," she said softly, "what's going on? Who were those men?" He didn't answer right away, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "They're not just bikers, Clara. They're part of something bigger, something dangerous. I didn't want you involved in this, but now—" He trailed off, his jaw clenching as he stared straight ahead. Clara's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. She knew Marcus had a past, a life before her that he rarely talked about. He'd always been vague about his time in the Marines, brushing off her questions with a smile and a kiss. But now she realized there was more to it than he'd let on. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "you're scaring me." "What? Aren't you telling me?" He glanced at her, his expression softening for just a moment before the hardness returned. "I'll explain everything," he said, "but not here. We need to get somewhere safe first." Clara nodded, though her mind was spinning with questions. She trusted Marcus with her life, but the fear in his eyes was something she'd never seen before. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than either of them. They drove for what felt like hours, the landscape outside the window shifting from the familiar streets of Willow Creek to the dark, winding roads of the countryside. Finally, Marcus pulled into the driveway of a small, secluded cabin tucked away in the woods. Clara had never been here before, and the sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. It was clear this wasn't just a vacation spot. This was a hideout. Marcus got out of the truck and came around to her side, helping her down with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm as he led her inside. The cabin was sparse but functional, with a single room that served as both a living area and a kitchen. Marcus moved quickly, locking the door and drawing the curtains before turning to face her. "Clara," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the words. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she waited, her mind racing with possibilities. "When I was in the Marines," he began, "I wasn't just a soldier. I was part of a special unit, one that handled sensitive missions, the kind of missions that don't make it into the history books." He paused, his eyes searching hers as if gauging her reaction. Clara nodded, urging him to continue. "We were good at what we did," he said. "Too good. And that made us targets. When I left the service, I thought I could leave that life behind. But some people, they don't forget. And now it seems they've found me." Clara's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. "Those bikers," she said slowly, "they're not just random thugs, are they?" Marcus shook his head. "No, they're part of a network, a group that's been hunting me for years. I thought I'd covered my tracks, but—" He trailed off, his fists clenching at his sides. I never wanted you to be part of this, Clara. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you'd be safe. But now, because of me, you're in danger." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his chest. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, "you're my husband. Whatever you're facing, we face it together. I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid of losing you." Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he could shield her from the world. But even as she clung to him, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The bikers were just the tip of the iceberg, and whatever was coming next, it would test them in ways they'd never imagined. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the sound like a warning. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, their enemies were closing in. And as Clara and Marcus stood together in the quiet of the cabin, they both knew that the fight was far from over. The question wasn't if the bikers would find them, it was when. And when they did, would they be ready? The tension hung heavy in the air, unresolved and unrelenting as the night stretched on, leaving them both wondering what the dawn would bring. The cabin felt smaller as the night wore on, the walls closing in around them like a cage. Clara sat on the edge of the worn couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Marcus paced the room, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and questions. Clara wanted to believe they were safe here, that the bikers wouldn't find them in this remote hideaway, but the look on Marcus's face told her otherwise. He was on edge, his eyes constantly darting to the windows, his body tense like a coiled spring. She had never seen him like this, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. "Marcus," she said finally, breaking the silence, "what happens? Now? We can't just stay here forever." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mix of guilt and determination. "I'm working on a plan," he said, his voice low. "There's someone I can call, someone who might be able to help us, but it's risky. If they find out I've reached out—" He trailed off, running a hand over his face. Clara stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly, "together. But you have to trust me, Marcus. I need to know what we're up against." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers before nodding. "Okay," he said, "but it's not just the bikers, Clara. They're just the foot soldiers. The real threat is the man behind them, a guy named Victor Kane. He's the one who's been after me all these years. He's ruthless, powerful, and he doesn't stop until he gets what he wants." Clara's stomach churned at the name, though she'd never heard it before. There was something about the way Marcus said it, the way his voice tightened, that sent a chill down her spine. "What does he want with you?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. "It's complicated," he said. "Let's just say I have something he wants, something he's willing to kill for. And now that he knows about you—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Clara understood. She was a liability, a weakness Victor could exploit to get to Marcus. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, but she refused to let it break her. She had always been strong, and she wasn't about to let some faceless enemy tear her life apart. The hours passed. Marcus made the call he'd been dreading. Clara listened from the kitchen, her heart pounding as he spoke in hushed tones to someone named Reyes. She couldn't make out the details, but the tension in Marcus's voice was enough to tell her this wasn't going to be easy. When he hung up, he looked more exhausted than ever. "Reyes is on his way," he said. "He's one of the few people I trust, but even he can't guarantee our safety. We need to be ready for anything." Clara nodded, though her mind was racing. She thought about her life back in Willow Creek, the quiet routines she'd built, the friends she'd made. It all felt like a distant memory now, like it belonged to someone else. She wondered if she'd ever get it back, or if this nightmare would consume everything she loved. But even as doubt crept in, she forced herself to focus on the present. They had to survive tonight first. Everything else could wait. Meanwhile, miles away, Victor Kane sat in the dimly lit back room of a rundown bar, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table. The bikers from the diner stood before him, their heads bowed in shame. Viper, his face still swollen from Marcus's punch, was the first to speak. "We didn't know he'd be there, boss," he said, his voice trembling. "But we'll find him, we'll make it right." Victor's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a cold smile. "You'd better," he said, his voice like ice. "Because if you don't, you'll wish Marcus had finished the job." The bikers nodded, their fear palpable before scurrying out of the room. Victor leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had waited years for this moment, for the chance to finally get what he wanted from Marcus. And now that he was so close, he wasn't about to let anything or anyone stand in his way. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, his voice calm but deadly. "Put the word out," he said. "I want every available man on this. Marcus doesn't leave this town alive, and neither does his wife." Back at the cabin, Clara and Marcus sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Outside, the wind had picked up, the trees swaying ominously in the darkness. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was closer than they realized. She glanced at Marcus, who was staring at the door, his hand resting on the gun at his side. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "I don't know," he said finally. "But if they do, I'll protect you no matter what." Clara nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of what that might mean. She didn't want to lose him, but she also knew they couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face Victor Kane and his men. And when that time came, she could only hope they were ready. The night stretched on, the tension in the cabin growing with each passing minute. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing through the woods. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she heard something else, a faint rustling like footsteps in the leaves. Marcus tensed, his grip tightening on his gun as he moved to the window. "Stay back," he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Clara's heart pounded as she watched him, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Were they out there? Had Victor's men found them already? The rustling grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. Marcus raised his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger, as the knob began to turn. Clara held her breath, her eyes locked on the door as it slowly creaked open. But what or who was on the other side they couldn't yet see. The suspense hung thick in the air, unresolved and unrelenting, as the story teetered on the edge of chaos. And in that moment, Clara and Marcus both knew that whatever happened next would change everything.